Welcome to a brand new episode of the Sri Lankan Understanding, where we explore where have we been as Sri Lanka, where are we now, and how does that shape our view of where we are going. And I want to explore this through the context of women's histories. How have women played a big part in the Sri Lankan understanding and the Sri Lankan history? And today, here at our location sponsor, the Mount Lavinia Hotel, I want to look at a conversation that I've been very, very interested in for a long time, and of course I needed to make it a priority in this episode, and that is women's access to justice. How have women navigated their access to rights and justice in Sri Lanka? And to have this conversation with me, Shanuki Dialvis, is a woman who's been a phenomenal and powerful voice in access to justice for women. I'm very privileged and very happy that she said yes to being on the show. Jerusha Thambiah, who is a gender practitioner, she's a lecturer, she's a legal counsel, and she's been a defender of women for quite a long time, and I am told by her peers and her sort of mentees that Jerusha is a voice like no other. And I've seen some of that myself in the past, so thank you for being here. Jerusha, if I was to just sort of start straight away by understanding, you know, the history of women's access to justice in Sri Lanka, like if we talk about colonial history or post-colonial history, how have sort of these legal frameworks and systems for women, how have they evolved over time? And historically, are there women in this sort of movement whose voices have maybe gotten erased? You were saying, you know, in terms of documenting these stories and how women have come to where they are today.
So thank you for having me, and thank you for that kind introduction. So when we look at our colonial past, our legal framework is heavily influenced by our Roman, Dutch, Portuguese and English laws. And like some kind of colonial hangover of that time, it also influenced our personal laws, which is the Muslim Thesavalama and the Kandyan laws. Now we look at Thesavalama laws, women couldn't hold property. We look at Muslim laws, they cannot have a divorce or separate the way a man can. We look at our inheritance and our property laws, all of that is extremely patriarchal and somehow doesn't sit well for the woman. So that is the background to our laws and the fact that we come from this Roman, Dutch and English based framework, which has affected us throughout the time. If we look at how things have evolved now, even coming into like domestic violence and the reforms that we've made with domestic violence, it still seems to be tempered with this patriarchal situation where we follow the Church of England's marriage more than anything kind of principles, where you are supposed to live in an abusive marriage, go for counseling and somehow protect your marriage. All of this coming from our colonial past. When we look at women, before coming here, when I was looking through it, we had an Agnes de Silva who was a very strong voice and a trade unionist who looked into maternity rights and wages and things like that. No real memory of this woman because she's not spoken of. We had a Vimala de Silva who was the first vice chancellor of a Sri Lankan university. So these firsts are always important because you have to pave the way through a very difficult boys' club. So women like that really stood in the forefront to bring education, to bring employment rights to women. Some of them not even remembered, some of them sound really cool and strong, but unfortunately we don't know enough to take that kind of inspiration. Yeah. So that is the kind of colonial laws and the past that have now, even up to today, colored the way we look at justice for women.
So before we had sort of a, let's say, a formal legal system that's dominating today, what were the ways in which sort of women from communities actually sought justice? Were there non-traditional or the traditional ways in which they sought justice, and any of these sort of traditional mechanisms or communal mechanisms, are they in use today still?
So the old-fashioned court systems were like tribunals, like village councils, like mediation boards, headed by elders from the community. The good news was, if you look at the Kandyan history, the matriarchs are quite strong. Sometimes even look like more matriarchal society than a patriarchal one. So they had a lot of women sitting in these councils. Even the North had women sitting in these councils. Some would even go as far as to say that at that point these women sitting there actually took on the responsibility to look at things through the lens of the woman. And they were fairly stronger in nature, and that sometimes laws now, tempered with our colonial histories and our patriarchal societies, don't do as much justice for the woman. So those were those traditional formats used in some rural areas, but not so much. Mediation has now been formalized and is now a legal process.
Okay. So if we were to talk about intersecting identities, because women is not a homogeneous group, we all know that, right? How have these, and I know you kind of touched on it at the beginning of this conversation also, like things like caste, things like religion, you know, ethnic identity, how have they informed how different women are able to seek justice? And have these changed over time, you think?
These identities play a very big role in Sri Lanka because this upper class and lower class and the caste system still prevails. The Govigama and the Verlalar women obviously have a lot more access to lawyers and justice in the way that somebody else wouldn't. The lower caste women in the north suffered much more in the hands of the civil war. The communal riots affected Muslim women from a slightly different class of society than it would somebody from a upper class society. Very recently also a story comes to mind, but basically if you have that kind of privilege and you come from a certain class, that opens the kind of doors to anything, even traditional, like even my profession, certain positions you can hold, even politics wise certain things you can hold, it's all dynasty based, or you come from a certain kind of lineage. Even in the north, if you look at today, I don't know whether other than Verlalar, a lot of the politicians come from any other caste. So that has a huge part to play, and for women, aside from their gender issue, they are now faced with this. Even when I did some research about sex workers in the north, their constant reply was, can't be from a good part of society. So it's always this attached different identities used to discriminate a woman who's already now not on par with the males in society.
Okay. And when we talk about privilege, one of the privileges I think that a lot of women in this country don't have is the education of your legal rights, and how this actually influences or impacts your ability to ask for justice. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
What I don't understand is we spend so much time and so many budgets on creating awareness through plays, through puppeteering, through videos, through YouTube videos, through rural collective women's organizations, through women's organizations. I mean, I myself in my 15 years of practice have been through a number of these awareness creating campaigns, but it still feels like it's not enough. It's probably because the so many years of not telling them that these are their rights and trying to hold them back. Sometimes when you talk to them also, they're conditioned to thinking it's not their right. The good news is I saw a big change during the COVID period, specifically because a lot of the women were locked up with their abusers. They were drinking and they were being abused at home. These hotlines that were being advertised, these kind of organizations, including CJ and I Pro Bono and Women in Need and all these hotlines, women knew they can come forward and get some assistance. And so we had a lot of domestic violence complaints filed during that period. Actually, courts were closed. We had to ask the Justice Minister to make it an emergency service so that DV applications can be made. And I also see now with online violence and LGBT, the community, they know their rights. They know that they cannot be persecuted in that way. So awareness has created that right. Okay. Online too, the shame is slightly going away, because I always tell them, you voluntarily shared a picture with somebody that you trust. The shame is with the person who's now using this in an inappropriate manner. And so that kind of awareness has really brought the younger generation forward, asking to have their rights cemented and to do the right thing against the perpetrator. So awareness does work, but it seems like it's always not enough.
Thank you for that. Awareness does work, and this conversation needs to keep going, and we will do so as soon as we come back from the commercial break. Welcome back to a conversation that must be had and must keep going. We talked about the history of women's access to justice and protections in Sri Lanka, but I want to talk about the status quo now. In 2025, we are still fighting to criminalize things like marital rape. We are still fighting for an adequate implementation of the law to issues like sexual and gender-based violence. Why is this, and how have women's rights movements influenced sort of changes towards these very much needed strengthenings?
So reforms is something that has been on our minds, and we've been working the last few years and putting out bills at a rate. But somehow every parliament and every government seems to prioritize everything else except putting this into action. So marital rape, as we sit, is also in bill stage. There was a lot of protest against it because even very normally reasonable thinking practitioners were like, what about false complaints? But that's true for anything, rape, murder, there will be false complaints. Why only this? It's like the married woman is some weird species that now somehow has a lack of rights because she needs to secure her husband. This is the same argument with domestic violence. How can you chase the man of the house? Nobody's trying to chase any good man of the home. Nobody's nuts. But when there is such a big form of violence, 1 in 3 women supposedly homicides are by an intimate partner, then it's not safe for anybody to have that kind of person. So the same argument applies with R versus R in the UK coming so long ago. We've taken so long to get marital rape forward. Domestic violence, there is some reforms that have been put forward. Rape, not only the male organ, but any other forms of instruments like our South Asian counterparts who have led before us, the laws are supposed to be reformed so that even using other forms of instruments will still be seen as rape. Online violence, stealthing, doxing, putting people's information out there, unsafe sort of behavior, obscenities. As we stand, even the woman who takes a picture of herself can be prosecuted. So those laws are all under reform, all at bill stage. Very good laws have been put forward. It'll only, I appeal to everybody in Parliament to prioritize women, because anything happens, whether it be a disaster, natural disaster, or a economic crisis, women are on the back burner all the time. So if they can prioritize this, this will go through very, very soon.
Yeah. And in cases like the sexual and gender-based violence and these issues, they're very sensitive topics, right? And sometimes, you know, it is a re-traumatizing process for a victim of violence to go through this whole legal process and all of that. So are there any plans right now to create special spaces, you know, specialized judicial procedures to look at these cases? And are there any, you mentioned like South Asian counterparts, like are there any success stories or case stories from South Asia that we can look at to inspire that here in Sri Lanka?
We need to look at our Indian counterparts. They push and they get their way with even LGBT rights and equality, even with the separate court system. Now we've had that chat. Shanuki, I want to be positive and tell you it will happen, but even our current court system is lacking in judges and it's inundated. It's going to be a long time before somebody thinks of SGBV as a separate court. But that would be ideal because it will speed it up. They can be gender sensitive. I have clients have taken to court for DV and the opposing counsel has harassed them so much that they've given up the case. So we need to train lawyers, the judges and the system itself to handle victims in a different manner. They cannot be re-traumatized, and that's what's done to them. And I feel very helpless because I can fight all I want at my end. But the system, the holistic system matters. There has to be psychosocial support. There has to be sensitivity with the judges and other people also. So a separate court would be fast tracking. It could be more sensitive. It could give a fuller approach. But in terms of how it is at the moment with our higher courts, our apex courts also lacking judges, it's going to be a while before we can actually practically put that in place.
Okay. Let's hope, fingers crossed, that it will come sooner than later. There is always hope. What about, you know, financial implications, right? Because again, a lot of legal recourse also counts on a woman's ability to afford these services and these processes, and sometimes they're long things. And is there anything in the works or any plans to make this a more sort of equitable thing for all women across socio-economic groups, like for them to access justice?
with all the things that we sort of find fault with our country, the one thing is that we've always tried to aspire to be a welfare state. Even when our economy doesn't really add up, we've tried to be that. So we have a legal aid system, which itself is struggling because of the overload, but they do a lot of matters for a lot of people who can't afford. We also have a mediation board that looks at family law matters. Mediation itself, I would say, is better than this kind of litigation process because it can be shorter and more amicable. That being said, we've had a lot of INGOs and a lot of NGOs support access to justice for women. What I like to tell the legal community is pro bono should be everyone's game. It cannot be only a few lawyers. All of us started off because our senior was into pro bono law. I always wanted to be a voice for women and children. It came to me naturally. But everyone should. I'm actually wanting to speak to our new BSL head who has a lot of plans for women's issues to talk to President's Council's chambers and get them to do at least 5 cases pro bono a year. That would level the playing field so much because the cost is bigger than the cost.
Yeah.
And if a person with I've seen cases where people have domestic violence where they've tattooed women's faces. A President's Council appears for the other side, and then this is all comes to nothing. So imagine leveling that playing field. So that has been on my mind. I want to actually create that awareness for all the chambers, because one thing I know about lawyers is somewhere deep within there is that call for justice, and when you go to them for help, they want to stand up and help. Maybe they don't know how, or some of these people don't go to them thinking expensive, I can't afford. If all of them tell the BSL we'll do this many cases pro bono, that could help the system in a very large way.
And I hope we can inspire more civic movement also towards sort of accelerating this call. And we will be back right after this commercial break to talk about where are we going in the justice system with women. Welcome back to this episode. Jerusha, we were talking about different things that influence a woman's access to justice. And whilst, yes, it's very much sort of the onus of the legal profession to support her and hold her up, it also takes a village. It takes an ecosystem. And that ecosystem involves key stakeholders like the police, for instance, like judiciary that doesn't support or empower the woman. What are we doing as Sri Lanka to provide training and to provide sort of reform even in the way they operate?
So I had the privilege of training the police, and a lot of the times I see them as the enemy because sometimes going to them is more difficult than anything else.
Yeah.
And so while training them, actually they taught me a lot of things in the sense that we have a cultural background also. So sometimes removing the head of the home because of violence can cause unsafe home situation where other neighbors, other men could be approaching this family. So there is also more to look at aside from this ideals that we have. It has to be balanced, but that doesn't mean that that's a good enough excuse to have an abuser under that cover in the house. So the police also very much inundated, sometimes trained in a wrong manner, them also convinced that marriage and family, a lot of people say that stay together for the children. I don't, as a family lawyer, I have the opposite to say. If it is an extremely toxic environment, that serves no one, including the children. If it is one stable single parent, still better. And I stand by that. So this whole cultural aspect has been trained, and the police now then perpetuates the same thing with the public. So while training them, I learned a lot. They are also extremely inundated. Also, women in the police treated very differently, a lot of jokes, kind of treated like lesser mortals. So they are working through their own issues also.
Yeah.
When it comes to the judiciary, very surprisingly, even in 2025, you'll have people who are like, you're not the first patient woman, marriage takes patience, and this entire lecturing that doesn't really help anybody, because women come to court not on their first go. They put up with a lot of things. Finally, they come mainly for their children, to protect their children. And these are not just average women also sometimes. It's doctors and people of a certain standing in society who've seen a lot of things, it takes a lot for them to come there and tell their problem. So I've been working with Justice Tilakavardhana and people like that to do sensitization. She has been working a lot. There are a lot of checklists put forward. And so the younger magistrates, the younger judges, I see a lot of change. They're going out of their way to be sensitive. They're very nice about things. Certain courts that I go to, they even take things up in chamber. And they even treat the perpetrator. So even online violence, I had a judge that was very tough on the situation, but also because the boy was young, he was a student, treated him also in a way that he will probably not do it again. And so they have such a huge role to play, and I hope that that continues, and this kind of sensitization and that kind of education will help them treat victims different from general litigants.
During the break, we were talking about how law school in Sri Lanka is dominated by women, female students, but still you said that, but they're not practicing. They pass out, but they're not practicing. Why is it? Why is that we have sort of qualified women lawyers who are not working towards women's rights?
So I lecture also, and it's my 13th year lecturing, and some of my students have won world prizes, all of them women, topping the batch women. A lot of very, very enthusiastic women. But the minute they come to court, it's a bit of a boys' club. That's how it has been. Even for me, I'm a 5th generation attorney, but first woman. So that goes to show that it has always been more a male sport. And so when they come and they're talked down to, or their clients are talked down to, I've had very smart women say, "Miss, this is not my thing. I don't want to do this. I don't want to be put down like this. I don't want to be harassed like this." So I think we need to look inwardly, because we're losing really good professionals and a real good addition that they can bring, because we are somehow not okay and open to having them. And so if you have privilege, if you have mums and dads and people who can support you, you make it. But when you're first generation and there's nobody to support you, then you don't. And some of those first generation girls, they can add a lot of solid value. So I still notice that the practice still very much a boys' club.
So in that brings me to a nice close of this conversation. My final question is, when you're looking inward and when you're trying to inspire more young women to take up this mantle and sort of fight that good fight, what are the barrier-breaking stories that we have of women? You mentioned a couple of them in history, but in today's day and age, are there unheard of stories of women in the system who have made these changes and who can be inspirational to the next generation?
I just want to make a quick point before I go on to the women, that we must not isolate the men.
Sure.
Behind every great man, there is a woman. Behind every successful woman, why shouldn't there be a man? So my senior, Mr. Sumandran, never treated me differently to the boys. Actually treated me more like I was the boy. Go fight, throw your hands up, go to the police station kind of thing. And that really worked in my favor. So I hope that a lot of men, and I also get a lot of men involved in the work, because it helps with putting it, because feminism is not a gender issue. It is equality, it's a human issue.
Right.
And if women are not treated well, it's going to affect everybody. Sure. So we have to get them involved. But when we look at women, just off the top of my head, in the recent past, we have the likes of Savitri Gunasekara, first law professor, vice chancellor of a university, made great strides with education. We have Radhika Kumarasamy, representative to the UN, lot of gender issues that she's looked at, a lot of things that can inspire us to become that kind of woman. The legal framework needs a lot of representation. So we have Justice Tilakavardhana. She was the first state counsel. She told me there was no women's bathroom. Even 2018, there was a case going on. I was heavily pregnant. I couldn't find a women's bathroom. I threw up in the male bathroom. And all the men not so excited about my nausea, but anyway, it is what it is. But so even just basic things like that have to change in order to have these women. So having that kind of representation, seeing her at the top, we had Shirani Bandaranaike, who was the first female CJ. Having that kind of representation helps always. A modern feminist is somebody I work with, Amiza Teagle, like effortlessly cool, always about making things better. She's going to kill me for saying this, but we take a lot of inspiration, because sometimes it's a very lonely road, and it feels like everybody against you. And if you do anything, you're either bad charactered, or you're not a good woman, or you're not patient enough, or you don't have these good. But having women to talk to and to resonate with and to push you forward and to stand behind you, that makes all the difference. So there are a lot of them actually, but there should be more. And I want the next generation, because they can inspire us too. And the fact that I don't get to have a lot of them in court is sometimes it's a sad thing.
Well, let's hope that this is one of many conversations that should happen to make sure that that future is realizable. Thank you so much. This is a subject we can talk about for days, but unfortunately we are out of time. And thank you for your fire, thank you for your passion, and thank you for keeping on,
thank you for having me,
on behalf of all of us. And thank you for joining us on this episode. We will see you next time.